Es de gran importancia introducir la discusión de la arquitectura en nuestro medio. La arquitectura es un producto cultural, mucho más allá de la operación inmobiliaria que estamos habituados a ver. Para mí también es un placer poderles presentar a Martino Stierli, del curador del MoMA. Ya les voy a explicar quién es Martino. Y para facilitar mi comunicación con Martino, me voy a pasar a inglés. Entonces, los que necesiten un sistema de traducción simultánea, atrás está para el que lo necesite. Martino Stierli is the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, a role he assumed in March 2015. Mr. Stierli oversees the wide-ranging program of special exhibitions, installations, and acquisitions of the Department of Architecture and Design. As the Swiss National Science Foundation professor at the University of Zurich Institute of Art History, Mr. Stierli focused his research on architecture and media. His project, The Architecture of Hedonism, 3 villas in the island of Capri, was included in the 14th Architectural Biennial in Venice. He has organized and co-curated exhibitions on a variety of topics, including the international traveling exhibition Las Vegas Studio, Images from the Archives of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, 2008-2014. Mr. Stierli's first monograph, Las Vegas in a Rearview Mirror, The City in Theory, Photography and Film, was published in 2010. He also authored a book on Robert Venturi, 2-year tenure at the American Academy in Rome in the mid-1950s, and has published essays on topics including Mies van der Rohe, use of photomontage, the relationship between Dadaism and avant-garde architectural montage, modern architecture and urbanism in Brazil, Rem Koolhaas, Delirious New York, and urban photography in Edward Ruscha's book. He has written extensively on contemporary architectural practice, including the work of Herzog and de Meuron, the recent global boom in high-rise buildings, and the architecture of Johnston Markley. His scholarship has been recognized with a number of prizes, among them the ETH Medal of Distinction for Outstanding Research in 2008, the Theodor Fischer Prize by the Central Institut für Kunstgeschichte, Munich, it's okay, Munich, and the 2011 Swiss Art Award for Architectural Criticism. In 2012, Mr. Stierli was a fellow at the Getty Research Institute in LA. Mr. Stierli has taught at various Swiss universities, including the Universities of Zurich and Basel, as well as the ETH in Zurich. He studied art and architectural history, German, and comparative literature at the University of Zurich, where he received his MA in 2003. From 2003 to 2007, he was part of the graduate program Urban Forms, Conditions and Consequences at the ETH Zurich, from which he received a PhD in 2008, and currently working on a book called The Montage at the Metropolis. Please join me in welcoming Martino Stierli. Thank you, Martino, for being with us here today, this afternoon. For us, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and we will have a very open conversation. You are welcome to jump in with questions and comments after we develop somehow the traction of the conversation. We have talked about a couple of questions and topics. My first question that will help a lot to understand why it's important to collect architecture, why it's important to exhibit architecture, and to give a brief context. In Colombia, there are no collections of architecture, though in the rest of the world there are a few, more than a few. There are no exhibitions of architecture in museums or galleries. So why, from your perspective, it's important to collect and exhibit architecture?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be in Colombia and Bogota. And I think you already sort of answered a little bit my question in your introduction in Spanish when you said architecture is a cultural discipline. And I think it's something that sometimes slips a little bit from our consciousness that architecture is the art of designing our everyday surroundings. And we know, of course, when we walk through the city or when we enter a space, that very often we are not immediately recognizing the design effort that went into it. And actually that's been theorized. Walter Benjamin writes about it, that the art of architecture, unlike looking at a painting which very much asks for contemplation, architecture is something or the experience of space is something that happens unconsciously. It's a tactile more than a visual sort of perception. And I think the task of the museum or any sort of cultural initiative, exhibiting, collecting, is to render conscious that which remains unconscious or somehow not present in our collective sort of consciousness. I can also give a historical answer to it. So you probably know that the Museum of Modern Art, where I work, was founded in 1929, so almost 90 years ago. And already in 1932, there was the first very famous exhibition, Modern Architecture International Exhibition, which has become known as the International Style Exhibition. And that was also at the same time the founding of a department of architecture within an art museum, which was rather revolutionary at the time. It is the oldest, the longest standing department of architecture in any museum of art in the world. And I think it's really important to keep in mind what Alfred Barr and Philip Johnson wanted. I mean, basically the Museum of Modern Art really was an operation to bring avant-garde and modernist art to the United States. But it was also, in a way, a much wider concept of introducing modernity as I don't want to say lifestyle, but as a way of being into broader culture and to popularize this new vision of how we live and how we see. Everything was new in the 20s. It was the new vision, it was the new perception, it was the new photography. It was also the new space, the new architecture, das neue Bauen, as they called it in German. And so I think it was, as much an aesthetic operation as it was a social operation. It really was about fundamentally changing how we operate and how we can conceive of urban space in a modern metropolis.
It astonished me a lot that it's since 1929. You mentioned
the museum, yes.
Yeah, the museum.
Yeah.
Since the beginning, they were willing to collect, or at least to have a museum approach type to architecture, because we take somehow architecture for granted. When we look at Colombian cities, history is somehow meaningless. We just have a few cities that still remain with the core of the historical center from the colony. There is a very big difference between Colombian cities and, let's say, Mexico or Peru. Colombia doesn't have a pre-Columbian tradition of architecture because our indigenous tribes didn't dwell in the same way as Incas or Mayas or Aztecs did. So there is this culture of the materiality that fades away, our constructions fade away, are destroyed, they don't last. So the role of the museums here and our relation with history, it's very important that we need to build it right now, because since all these memories, all these legacies fade away, all the material culture we have fades away, we have a very strange relation with history. How do you see the role of history today and the role of the museum when they want to acquire a collection, an archive, a file? Why is it important to have a file of an architect somehow intact or somehow secured in a museum so it can last and create a kind of a culture? Why is it so important to keep these kind of documents safe?
In a way, I think the answer is almost self-evident. Why do you collect? Why does a museum collect paintings. In the end, it's about representing a history or maybe competing histories of artistic experimentation and advancement of new technologies and all kinds of things. I mean, insofar as we look at modern art, which is very much, of course, a narrative of, you know, invention and advancement and so on, which of course we can question and we should question from a postmodern perspective. But the very same thing, of course, applies to architecture. The museum, the idea of the museum, of the Enlightenment idea of the museum as a repository for historical artifacts that sort of in their as a group have the capability of telling, you know, a part of human history. That of course also applies to architecture, and I think the museum has two tasks. I mean, on the one hand, of course, we want to be a platform for architectural discourse. So it's very important that we have a collection of the history of modern architecture that architectural students can come to see and learn and understand what, you know, to understand what the contemporary condition means vis-a-vis the history of modernity. And I think, you know, I'm a historian and I believe strongly that without knowing what was before you, you're ignorant and you are, in a way, lost. And so I think the task of the museum is to be able to give an education for the discipline. But also, I think we have the responsibility to address a wider audience, people who may not, you know, have any interest or idea of architecture. And there is the task is very much, which I said before, to raise an awareness that art or architecture is a discipline that is fundamentally involved in shaping how we see things in our everyday environment, how things are made visible to us or kept from being visible to us. And you know, that is sort of the dual task, addressing the discipline but also addressing the wider audience. And of course, besides this more traditional understanding of what a museum does, collecting and exhibiting artifacts from the past, we also, of course, want to be a platform for contemporary production. And, you know, we have, for example, the Young Architects program, which is an annual competition with young architects, where they are invited to build a pavilion in our sister institution, MoMA PS1, which is our Center for Contemporary Experimentation in Queens. And this is an extremely successful project that has really launched careers of New York-based architects. Some of them have become very, you know, very, very successful, not least through that program, I would say. And then, of course, we also have a certain activist streak, sort of. We have a series of programs that's called Issues in Contemporary Architecture. One was, for example, about climate change and how, you know, the rising sea levels will fundamentally change how we can live in port cities such as New York. You know, actually the final exhibition was really almost only a side product. What was really important was a series of workshops where architects sort of in public designed or you know, started a conversation about how architecture can contribute to these fundamental questions. We're working on one now on racial issues and spatial politics, which is of course a big topic in the United States with its heavily segregated society, and of course also in the context of the political situation that the country is in, that we feel very strongly that we should, you know, raise awareness of how urban space in the United States has fundamentally been shaped according to racial, you know, issues.
I found fascinating how this idea of curating, creating content of architecture from within the Museum of Modern Art in New York, it's able to break the boundaries of the building. and it goes far beyond the white box or the building itself, and then turns out to be a public space with the Young Architects program in Queens in PS1, also with the, I don't know how you call it, the parallel program in Chile, that it's been also going on for now a couple of years. So how this architecture that seems to be a very close discussion that perhaps we in Colombia, we take for granted, that we don't talk about architecture since we don't read nobody writing about architecture in the newspapers. We don't go to museums to see architecture. There are no current architecture magazines that you can buy anywhere. Architecture magazines are produced by universities but stay within the university. So there is no relation or this discussion between the people and the architects, the city and the institutions from that perspective. So I guess that has led us to a very strange situation, which is that we all live in cities. Most of our Colombian population live in cities. 76% of our population live in cities. 24% live in the rural areas or outside the cities. But when we want to, let's put it in a very conflictive word, when we want to consume architecture, we only do it through real estate operations. That's what architecture means to many here in Colombia. How can this structure be broken? How can architecture go outside and create these links, either from the museums, the galleries? What are the tools that you have seen around the world? How is this culture being inserted into everyday life, that architecture becomes a discussion that takes place on a daily basis?
I mean, in a way, I think you're describing a phenomenon that's not specific to Colombia. I mean, there's like in New York, you would think there is a very vibrant architectural discourse. Actually, not so much. There's not much architectural criticism left in the New York Times, for example, or in magazines such as the New Yorker or New York Magazine. And, you know, I mean, I think it's to keep architecture present as a cultural discipline, and you know, the awareness for it, I think, is very much the task of the architectural discipline itself. And I do sometimes feel that architects tend to prefer talking to themselves in a club setting and not really be terribly interested in reaching out to society at large. And we talked about some biennials that we've visited, and I think, that's a problem. I mean, in a one way, it's, architecture exhibitions can be very enjoyable for architects, but they may not really speak to the society at large because they forget to tell the wider audience how important it is to think of architecture as a social and as an urban discipline as much as an aesthetic discipline. I'm obviously very interested in the aesthetic side of architecture, but in the end, what makes architecture different from all the sister arts is that it is a fundamentally engaged art that takes place in our everyday setting, and to make that sort of present in our heads, that's very much the task of the architects themselves, I think.
Yes, I think that we can go a little bit into the idea of the biennials, in the sense that for all the public, every 2 years, there is the Venice Architecture Biennial. It takes place in Venice, of course. There is a curator that presents a topic or a main title with a certain interest, and then architects present projects, different approach of how they understand architecture. But in the last years, we have seen a wide proliferation of biennials. Now we have Seoul Biennial, we have a Chicago Biennial, a Venice Biennial, and a long list of names. Among those names, it's very rare to find Colombia as a participant. Perhaps some architects get invited, but in many of them, for instance, Venice, each country has a pavilion that one year serves their interest for art, dance, cinema, and the other year serves for architecture, music, and something else that I don't remember right now. And
film, dance.
Film, dance, music, and something else that doesn't come to my mind right now. So in that constant exposure, you see how architecture gets a contrast of what's happening or what's going through the mind, not only of the curator, but also of the national participation in each one of them. When you go through them, you will see extremes, for example. Just right now, it's the Chicago Biennial open. It opened 1 month ago. It's curated by Mark Lee and Sharon Johnston. And we can place that on one side that we were talking before, like the biggest quality of the biennial for me is that it's a biennial of architecture. It's about architecture. But for many will claim that the biggest failure of the biennial is that it's a biennial about architecture. It doesn't break the shell of trying to relate with very different conditions that happen in the world. So somehow in the last 4 years, we have these two extremes. Last year, the curator of Venice Biennale was Alejandro Aravena. Alejandro Aravena is a Chilean architect that's been recognized through his projects of social housing and social defense of many of the unheard, of many of the forgotten ones. But somehow, this is this very clear line that takes architecture right now. Either the architecture for architects, in a way what happened in Chicago Biennial, or this extremely open idea of architecture that happened in Venice Biennial. How do you see this pendulum of architecture, of contemporary architecture, moving right now from your perspective between these lines or other lines that you see?
I mean, I think the pendulum is a good metaphor to describe it. I'm pretty sure that the next architecture biennial in Venice, which opens in May, will, move more towards formal questions. I'm assuming, at least. So, I think both sides are possible, and I very strong belief in dialectics as a process of knowledge, and so having these two things, present at the same time, I think is very productive, as opposed to trying to separate them, which I find then sometimes a little, boring. You raised another really interesting question, the representation of, now in particular Colombian architecture, culture, on the global scale. So on the one hand, I think that the model of the Venice Biennial is somehow, of course, very outmoded. It's the 19th century nation-state idea where each country has its pavilion and you sort of compete, and in the end you get a gold medal or a gold lion or whatever. It's actually kind of silly if you think about it, but of course that's the structure of that exhibition, and you're not going to be able to change it so quickly. And in a way it's also, of course, an interesting way to sort of gather every 2 years within a country, I mean, or a nation, some interesting voices and represent that towards the world. What I think is very important for this to be a success is, besides what I said before, architects' initiative, also institutional support. And I think it's fantastic that an art fair such as ARTBO actually, dedicates some space to reflect on architecture as a cultural and aesthetic discipline. I realize when I go to these international events that countries such as Chile, that have a very strong contemporary architecture scene, also make a very deliberate effort of helping spread the gospel. I mean, the Chilean, for example, the Chilean cultural, whatever you call that, the guy who works in the Chilean consulate, reaches out to me and keeps me attaché, the cultural attaché, you know, keeps me informed about what's going on, invites me to events. That's very important because obviously there's so much news that get to me in that channel, and the more a strong institution or even a government stands behind an effort, the more credible it becomes. It's of course also it's also tricky. I mean, you can also be very critical about it. If you think about how things are funded, if you want to do institutional critique, that's also of course important and necessary. But I do think that institutional support is vital for the discipline of architecture, as it is for, you know, for the art world as well. So that's important to keep in mind.
I think the word you used, that it's institution, it's very important, not only from the political point of view or cultural point of view, but also as a social and historical responsibility. I'm going to move swiftly a little bit toward the idea of the archives, for example. Let's imagine that the archive of national architects here in Colombia is very reduced. There is an amount of archives that lie in the National University of modern architects. For example, the archive of Rogelio Salmona has been protected by a foundation under his name. But there are hundreds, I would say, of drawings, documents from many other offices that were very relevant during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and for sure they will be very relevant in the near future. What happens when these archives nobody will want them, which is usual, that when the family of the architect, when the architect dies, the family doesn't know what to do with it. Many times they just throw it into the garbage. The collection of books that usually were extremely beautiful collections are given to somewhere, not a specific spot where when it can become a document for research. What do you think of the power of institutions of MoMA, like MoMA, to protect those archives? Nowadays that we talk about this very political word and political world about coming from somewhere and coming from anywhere, in the sense that our institutions are too weak sometimes to protect these archives. And then these archives go somewhere else. And once somebody raises the hand and believes it's interesting, perhaps it's too late. It's already in another institution. Take, for instance, the question of Barragán with the Vitra related situation. I can summarize the story of Barragán archive because I think it's relevant as a case for Colombia and Latin American countries. Barragán was a very important architect, a modernist architect from Mexico. When he died, his archive somehow was not valued enough. The archive went to a private collection as a gift to a woman. Then, many years later, an artist, Gil Magid, is her name, right? Gil Magid, created this kind of proposal. They will take out part of the dead body of Luis Barragán. They will create a diamond. They will make a ring. And they will give the ring to the owner of the archive. And in exchange, he will return the archive to Mexico. It's a tricky, strange consideration, but without entering into the discussion of the proposal itself, what's the role of the institutions to protect the archives? How do you engage the idea of protecting or taking care of the archives?
It's actually a very complicated question because, as a general rule, the museum does not collect archives. And why is that? In the end, we are an institution that, you know, has the task of organizing exhibitions, and through exhibitions, producing a discourse on architecture and the history of modern architecture through the exhibition. And an architect's archive is usually extremely, you know, voluminous and contains many, many, many things that will never be exhibited. But that might be interesting for research. And that's just not, you know, MoMA is a big institution, but it's of course a small institution compared to a research university that has thousands and thousands of students. And so we, for example, acquired a few years ago the Frank Lloyd Wright archives from the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, but we acquired it together with Columbia University. Knowing that, I mean, the archive contains about 300 models, about 20,000 drawings, you know, films, hundreds of thousands of pages of, you know, written documentation. First of all, where do we store this? And what is the point of having this in a museum, because you're not ever going to show 20,000 drawings. You need one drawing of one, you know, project perhaps. And so that's the deal we reached with Columbia, to basically keep all the two-dimensional, the drawings there, and make it accessible to scholars, to students, so it can produce, yeah, scholarship. And we of course have access when we need something, when we want to make an exhibition, which, you know, we will do regularly and in different contexts. We also own the Mies van der Rohe archives, which was, you know, given to us by Mies, or actually, you know, when Philip Johnson was still the chief curator. And so that's a sort of historical friendship that led to this anomaly. But it is a problem. So in general, we don't collect archives. And again, I think the most important institutions to be aware of the legacy of architectural archives should be probably national universities, or, you know, the universities where these architects studied or taught. Because research universities usually have the capacities, they have the size, and they have the space to not only make sure that the archives are kept, but also that they're made accessible. I mean, in the end, that's what a university should be all about, to be, you know, a repository for past knowledge in the sense of a library. I also am, you know, also not a fetishist of archives. I think not everything that everybody ever produced in their lifetimes is worth preserving. There's also, it can be very oppressive also to have this notion that everything is worth keeping. So I think an archive should also always be curated. It should not just be a heap of stuff. It should be a very, you know, informed selection of, you know, based on decisions on what we from a current perspective you can think would ever be important in the future for us to understand history.
I wanted to complement something there that I think it's also very valuable, which is all these lateral institutions that play an interesting role articulating between museums and universities. And I wanted to put the example of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, which is a fascinating center funded by, let's say, a private obsession. Only private obsessions sometimes lead to communal benefits. In the case of Phyllis Lambert, she was the daughter of the heir, she's the heir of the Seagram Company. The Seagram Company was a spiritus beverages company, as it's well recognized. They made a very beautiful building in Park Avenue, just a little bit above Waldorf Hotel. And Phyllis Lambert, when she was really a young student, she engaged her father and convinced him that they need to hire Mies van der Rohe to do the building. Her father agreed, and they had this kind of masterpiece that it's still standing there in Park Avenue. But then, now Phyllis Lambert is something like 92 years old, and it's very active in protecting and conserving architecture archives, architecture files, drawings. It's a very dynamic institution that it's in Montreal, if I'm not wrong, yes, it's Montreal. And it's one of these kind of institutions that it's constantly trying to go out of the white box, also trying to search for files everywhere in the world. They have files from architects from Spain, from England, from many other places. So they are always kind to opening the discussion of trying to create this legacy that architecture has, that it's very different from the idea of national history. Because national history only means something to those who had the experience of those events, or that means something to them. I believe the beauty of architecture history, it's an open text that can be used or can be utilized or can be engaged from any perspective, because architecture as a human, let's say, condition belongs to all of us. So somehow what happens with these institutions is they are keeping these treasures safe in many cases. So my question for all this paraphernalia that I'm doing right now is, what do you think, or how do you believe it's politically incorrect when an institution goes around the world extracting all these legacies out of their context?
Yeah, that's of course the post-colonial question, and it's a very important one that we think about a lot. As you know, the museum, many of you probably know, we had 2.5 years ago, a big survey exhibition on Latin American architecture between 1955 and 1980, which, you know, I think was a landmark exhibition on a global scale, and it received a lot of criticism from Latin America. Many people thought it was too biased towards Brazil, others thought it was too biased towards Argentina. It did result in the acquisition of 600 drawings and models from all over Latin America, and museums, you know, the Department of Architecture and Design before had 3 objects or drawings relating to Latin American architecture, and now all of a sudden it was 600. And of course you could say that is a very problematic move, because you're decontextualizing and you're using big bucks to take something away from the culture where it belongs to. At the same time, I think the Museum of Modern Art is not just a US-American institution. It's sort of an institution that strives to be globally, you know, credible for the representation of the history of modernity. And for too long, the history of modernity and modernism was told from a very Eurocentric perspective. I mean, modern architecture, even modern art, basically meant Western European and North American art and architecture. So our paintings collection was basically French modernism and then the New York School. And that was sort of the canonical history of painting, and the same applies to architecture. We have, of course, the Bauhaus legacy, and we have Corbusier, and then we have some, maybe a little bit of Finnish architecture. Actually, there was always a certain recognition of Brazilian and Mexican architecture being relevant, but that's about it. And I think now, you know, with our awareness of the world being really an interconnected place, and a place that has been connected through networks for many decades, we realize that this is a completely inadequate way of representing modernity. So I think it's very important for us to be able to collect material from places such as Latin America and Africa and Asia and Australia, exactly because these histories have not been told and have deliberately been neglected for decades and decades. And it does mean a critical move of removing things from their natural habitat, but it allows, I think, for, you know, a fantastic opportunity to tell a more nuanced history of modernism, and to be able to tell you know, a plurality of histories as opposed to just one canonical, narrow-minded, Western biased. I mean, Western, of course, Latin America is also Western, but I mean North American and Western European in particular.
I guess I will drive myself into a swamp. I don't know if I will be able to get out of it safe of what I'm about to say, because I think there is something that I call the Kenneth Frampton curse, which is in the late...
To tell who Kenneth Frampton is.
Yes. Kenneth Frampton, it's a historian, and late 60s, early 70s, he wrote a book called Critical Regionalism. With the writing of critical regionalism, and this is where I'm getting into the swamp, he somehow gave value to, let's say, unheard voices of architecture that were previously not noted by the critic, coming out of the modernism or those second and third modern generation. So what he did was that he was putting into the radar, a couple of architects such as Rogelio Salmona, and gave them a voice into the world discourse. But for me, I believe it's called the Kenneth Frampton curse for one reason, which was that he did it in a very patronizing way. He somehow, here comes the first dilemma. He somehow did something like this. All these architects, one day, not yet, can be like us. They are very exotic. They do work with different tools. They want to be modern. They are almost modern, but they are not yet like we are. But we give them value because they respect context, because they use other techniques, because they are vernacular, because they use something that we have not yet looked into it. But one day they will have a value and will create this kind of a system that will be appreciated as if they were belonging to the Western narrative of architecture. That's the first conflictive point of view. The second, I would say, going somehow in favor of or against this, I would say, isn't it easier in the sense of accepting something that we try to deny constantly, which is, isn't it architecture thinking, architecture theory, architecture narrative from a historical point of view, a European way of thinking? And just by accepting it, isn't it possible for Latin America, as many other countries, to really insert the discussion as equals, but not as a patronizing way of giving like a small medal as a prize, like one day you will be like us? Do you understand my point of view?
I do, but I think it's a very polemical way of seeing it, and I don't think it's... I think that the Latin America exhibition that was, curated by a MoMA curator, my predecessor Barry Bertel, together with 3 Latin American curators. So it was a deliberate attempt of not just sort of exerting an outside look, sort of a reading of Latin American architecture, for whatever that is, through the lens of a Western perspective. I'm working on an exhibition on the architecture of post-war Yugoslavia, and it's something I didn't really know much about before I started being fascinated by it, and I don't speak Serbo-Croatian. So that's very tricky, and for this reason I have a co-curator who is actually, he lives in the United States, but he's originally from the region. And we have a curatorial advisory board of about 12 people that represent all the places and countries that we are going to highlight. So I think there are ways to be, sensible and sensitive about these issues and making sure that you are not just exerting a patronizing outside look onto the material and basically apply your Western narrative onto that material. And I do think, coming back to the Latin America exhibition, that the underlying thesis was that this is not just an exotic, surreal counterpart to North American modernism, but that it was actually that Latin America in that period that this exhibition looked at was an unbelievable laboratory of spatial and formal and material experimentation that was at least on equal par with what was going on in North America. And I think, in my mind at least, the exhibition succeeded in totally convincingly arguing that. So yes, it is tricky, but I think there are ways to circumvent that. And obviously, you know, why I'm of course here to be part of this panel, but I'm of course also you know, profiting from the opportunity to learn something about Colombian architecture. And I think to have this discourse and building a network with the people on the ground who really know, that's what a curator is all about. And so yeah, that's
I do fully agree with you about the exhibition of MoMA. At the recent exhibition of Latin America, I think it was very well, the pieces were very well put together, and the point was very clear of even giving a voice of authenticity to all this modernity, as if it was a Latin American creation of its own, as it was. And that was beautiful. But for me, in the sense of, there are, I would say, a couple of dark years. And it's between late 60s and half 80s, when this kind of curtain, iron curtain, fell into the idea of what to expect from Latin American architecture. Still today, the cliché got inserted into what Latin American art should be. And it depends a lot of this frame that Kenneth Frampton drew years ago. So it's very difficult for disciplinary way of attending the discipline in Latin America to produce something out of the cliché. If a product of architecture from Latin America comes out into the market, into the system, I would say, the first question is, does it attend social issues? Is it made by participatory processes? Is it made by communitary institutions? So somehow there is always this pre-expected condition of what Latin American architecture is. And it falls into this trap created by Kenneth Frampton, I will say, that it's not been answered yet. Because for the moment, for the historical moment, there was this kind of leftist, socialist way of thinking about how to bring these unheard voices into the scene, dealing somehow or trying to negotiate or navigate between this historical Rossi approach, this way of looking into things from Venturi. So why not Kenneth Frampton raising the hand and saying, I have a different view. I will look into all these people that have nothing to do with these issues and then create myself a position and have a discourse out of it. That's where I have a problem, because it grew up so strong in the universities in Latin America. For instance, there was this thing called the Seminarios de Arquitectura Latinoamericana, SAL, that created a very thick curtain over architecture in Latin America. It was this group of friends and colleagues and critics traveling around Latin America, deciding what was coming out from Latin America and what was coming in. It was a very strong network that for many years considered that Colombian architecture was Rogelio Salmona. And I do agree, Salmona is one of the voices of Colombian architecture, but it's not the only one. So somehow they began to create this kind of paradigms that were creating this discourse, opening doors, opening barriers, but riding only one horse, while Colombia, in its geographical diversity, in its different cultural proposals, it's not only Rogelio Salmona. There are many ways of engaging that. So somehow, what they were doing is creating this, this hero, this national hero. And they selected one in each country. They had Salmona in Colombia. They had this, the name is slipping right now, from Juvenal Baraco for a while in Peru. Barragan in Mexico, of course. So it was this very strange situation of how managing the information that was coming out. Of course, it was a different world. There was no internet, there was no connectivity, there was no networks, power was more centered. Magazines played a role. In that moment, we had two very important magazines in Colombia. One was called Proa, founded in early 30s. It was a very important magazine that ran until mid-90s. And the second one was called Scala. And they were creating a very beautiful archive of managing this information with a lot of interesting critical texts. But then all this began to fade away with the change of the century, of the entering the year 1000, the 2000 year. After then, Salmona died, and then all this kind of very strange situation began to happen all across Latin America. All this is coming to the point of how this, how to explain it, how these positions take place in a contemporary world where information goes extremely quick, but documents go extremely slow. For example, the role of the architecture critic, the role of writing a book. Somehow what we were talking this morning a bit. How do you see this situation of speed of information and how this creates a view, a frame, a situation?
So you're raising the question of the new media and the internet and so on, and I'm actually not so critical of this. I think it's a fact of life, and actually it has enormous advantages because it's possible to get an enormous amount of information in very short time. But of course, the number or the amount of information is so overwhelming that it's sometimes difficult to spend some time with that information. And I think that is actually one of the great tasks of the museum in the future. And I think it's something that we already realize living in this multimedia environment that we live in, that there is, the increasing virtualization of our world creates, sort of has a backlash. It almost creates a longing for authenticity and the real thing. I mean, I think, why are we now so interested in locally produced foods and in handcraft and all that? I think is a direct reaction to the digital, this longing for the real, as if the digital weren't real, of course, but I mean, and so I think that's something that the museum can really, we have the actual objects, and we can create an aura around these objects and create an experience, in a sense, of something that may get lost in the virtual reproduction of things and objects. And so I'm actually very hopeful. I think the digital doesn't supplant or kill an older form of knowledge, but it actually enhances it and produces new opportunities, I think.
Okay, what do you think if we open some questions to the public? Okay, that's good.
Bueno, primero me gustaría aclarar una situación. Yo he estado investigando un poco sobre como las colecciones del MoMA en cuanto a las instalaciones que están relacionadas con procesos arquitectónicos, no tanto en sí al background como de un proceso arquitectónico, pero sí instalaciones que están como en un límite entre arte y arquitectura. Y me he dado cuenta que no hay como tal adquisiciones del MoMA y de muchos otros centros en cuanto a estas piezas. Quería saber un poco las razones de esa brecha entre exponer y no coleccionar. Tal vez una pregunta sobre la economía del espacio, si es complicado guardarlas o si el hecho de que estén diseñadas para un espacio en específico hace que no se adquieran y no sean parte como de un archivo como tal museístico.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. What are you referring to? Which kind of objects do we exhibit but not collect?
Por ejemplo, las obras instalativas, como de Dojosu o artistas que se relacionan arquitectónicamente, pero como tal que no hacen parte de un documento, como tal no son los bocetos de una obra, no son los planos, sino son más bien procesos instalativos muy cercanos como al pensamiento arquitectónico y espacial.
Well, there's probably a pragmatic answer to that indeed spatial installations are very difficult to collect because they take up a lot of space. And also, I mean, as a historian, there's also a methodological answer. As a historian, I would say contemporary production is, of course, we pay a lot of attention to it, but at the same time, it often takes a little time to understand what really is relevant in order to tell the history of the contemporary. And so you get in real trouble if you start collecting everything, every program that we do. Or what would the criteria be for collecting one installation but not the other? I believe that there are other ways of representing the contemporary, and it's exactly what you mentioned. It's the processual, to be able to show the building of a pavilion or of some spatial construction is in itself, you know, a strong way of showing the relevance of that. It doesn't necessarily have to be collected. What we could collect and what we sometimes collect are, of course, mediatic representations, like documentations of how it was built and how it worked as a space. And so, you know, your question is very, I think, is a very complex one. In the end, it really asks about the relationship between the contemporary and the modern. It's a perennial struggle in our institution. How do we deal with the contemporary? And I personally think to deal with the contemporary is more successful if you use the museum as a space for production and reflection and discourse than necessarily as a repository of the final artifact.
There is a series of from the Serpentine Gallery in London. There is this series of collectible architecture, if you can call this. Do you know if there are other kind of institutions who are doing like the same thing, because they have this program where architects and artists work together and the final product is being bought by people and in some institutions, or they are because they do these pavilions and then they ask themselves what are we doing with these pavilions afterwards. So some collectors actually are collecting architecture, like buying them. Do you know from other, or can you talk about more about this collectible architecture?
Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning the Serpentine Pavilions. And I have to say, as the representation of MoMA, that the Serpentine Pavilion was directly inspired by the Young Architects program at MoMA, which has been running since 1999. The Serpentine Pavilion started, I think, in 2006 or 2007. And very much like the Serpentine Pavilion, the Young Architects program is a program to install a pavilion. We, however, believe that it's not so interesting to give well-established architects who are already having a very successful career an opportunity to build a pavilion that really, you know, sort of tries to transform architecture into a piece of art or a sculpture. I mean, that can be interesting, but we think at MoMA that it's more important for us as an institution to enable unknown firms, young people who never have built anything, an opportunity for the first time to present a spatial installation in front of a larger audience and to be judged by that. So, you know, I understand there are obviously there's good reasons to collect architecture as art. We at MoMA just think that is not really, you know, it's not our task to provide the art market with a structure to sustain itself. I think we believe in architecture as a critical discipline, and we want to enable, you know, we want to help young studios to launch a successful career, as opposed to sustaining already well-established architectural offices and allowing them to branch out into the art world. It's a little polemical, but yeah. But I think the model is extremely successful. I mean, I know that the M+ in Hong Kong is starting this. The Young Architects program is a thing that's not only happening in Santiago de Chile and in New York, but also in Istanbul, in Rome, in Seoul. So it's a global initiative. There are many other institutions who have tried to, you know, sort of emulate that model, and I think it's a very successful one.
And I would like to give you also an example from the private, extremely private side. There is this gallery in France that is called Solo Gallery. They have commissioned houses to a couple of architects. Among them, it's Justin Markley, Barozzi Veiga, to mention a few of them. They have a couple of hectares in the southern part of Spain. They build a house. They keep the house. Some of them are for rent. And as I understand, they sometimes are planning or willing to sell them at a certain moment, but they develop a kind of a piece of land within the work of hiring these mid-40s, 50s age architects. It's called Solo Gallery.
Main feature that differences architecture from other kinds of art may be the experience that people may have when finding it. So it's not just observational, but you can get involved in the work. So I had the question that, has the role of the museum evolved somehow to exploit this experiential a situation with architecture as a part of art? Like, have you used this advantage or feature of architecture to involve people with art through the experience of the space and the object? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we have a small collection of architectural performances. So we basically, like in the art world, we buy the right to perform a piece of architecture at some time in the future. Who knows if we'll ever do it, but at least we own it. Which also shows you sometimes the problems of, you know, collecting, which was the question I was raised earlier. But, you know, the experiential side, I think it's very important. And of course, as we know, contemporary art forms are very much about experience. I mean, of course, there is still painting as a very valid contemporary form of production, but there are so many time-based, you know, art forms, performances, media installations, and so on, that really have a very strong presence in our museum. In fact, we're in the process of an expansion, which is going to open in 2019. The new expansion, which is built by Diller Scofidio and Renfro, will include a studio space, which will allow us to have a continuous program of performances ongoing, so a real theater. We have always had, I mean, since the 1930s, cinema, so film is always been a very important part of MoMA, and we are also hoping to show more of these, you know, film and other time-based forms in the gallery spaces going forward. So very much, I think the notion of experience and of experiencing space is something that where I think architectural production and contemporary artistic research really interact in interesting ways, which are super, good for us to exploit.
Hi. If we see the city as a big museum that is in constant change, how could we as architects, do you think we could like create a narrative between the constructions every year? Like we can create a narrative of the city, looking at it like a big museum. The question goes to if we can curate the city as a big museum with a narrative.
I think Camilo should answer it because he's a practicing architect.
Yo diría que no. Diría que si entendiéramos la ciudad de esa manera estaríamos tematizándola. Estaríamos tratando de imponer un solo modelo, una sola manera de ver la ciudad. Considero que la ciudad en su libertad es lo que es, en el sentido en que puede aparecer algo que nos llena de emoción y algo que nos produce una repulsa absoluta. Pero eso es lo bonito de la ciudad, y es que es capaz de construir muchas ciudades de una sola manera en un mismo territorio, y que todos los días cuando la recorremos todos hacemos una lectura diferente. Si entendiéramos la ciudad como un museo en la que solamente hay una manera de mirarla, o hubiera una institución de poder diseñando esa ciudad, estaríamos construyendo de alguna forma un pequeño parque temático, de una sola manera de hacer. Viviríamos en una especie de un pequeño Disneylandia. Entonces lo bonito de la ciudad también es que es real en la medida en que suceden estas cosas que nos producen un sentimiento terrible de desprecio incluso que se hace con el espacio público o ese amor que podemos sentir por recorrer un parque y poder intercambiar algo en una esquina. Pero esos dos contrastes son los que verdaderamente hacen la ciudad y los que hacen que la ciudad sea real. De la otra manera estamos sobrecontrolando los procesos de la ciudad y creo que sería un error pretender tener una sola mirada y una sola materialización de ella.
Bueno, pero entonces en ese caso, no sé, cómo la arquitectura sí es algo que nos da una experiencia propia, ¿no? Y creo que la arquitectura no solo puede tener una lectura, sino que pues, frente a una obra pueden tenerse varias lecturas. Y no sé, como ya relacionando esto como con el papel de las instituciones, por ejemplo, ayer hablábamos con Cuauhtémoc Medina, que era el curador de la exposición de Gil Magid sobre toda la polémica que se hizo en torno al anillo de Barragán. Él nos decía que bueno, la obra que propuso Gil Magid con el anillo de Barragán, pues sí, era una obra que fue promocionada, que tenía un trasfondo, que era interesante, pero que él nunca se esperó como que de un momento a otro esto llegara a los medios y se desatara una polémica de tal magnitud. Entonces ya como traspolando eso a este punto de vista, pues como estas visiones que se tienen sobre la arquitectura, como qué pasa cuando una obra que nos evoca a nosotros algo, una obra arquitectónica evoca en algo nosotros, llega digamos a interés de las instituciones como el MoMA y como que se vuelve parte del discurso, o también lo vuelve como algo mediático, como que le da un trasfondo. Entonces como que finalmente yo sí veo que las instituciones tienen, o cuál es el papel que tienen las instituciones como para dar ese trasfondo a las obras de arquitectura, así como los medios y la polémica en Gil Magid también se volvieron parte de la obra como tal. O sea que como las instituciones ayudan a conformar ese discurso y a decir como hacia dónde debe ir la arquitectura, como qué responsabilidad deberían seguir, hacia dónde deberían apuntarle las instituciones, digamos como el MoMA o incluso aquí en Colombia, las instituciones que se fijan en la producción de arte, qué responsabilidad tienen y hacia dónde deberían apuntarle para saber quiénes son los que dicen hacia dónde debe ir la producción arquitectónica.
Well, that's of course a huge. That's the responsibility of the curator, and we it's true, when we elevate something into the collection, it usually means, it has an enormous boost on the mediatic side. On the other hand, we have so many things in our collection that are completely forgotten. So you should also not overestimate the power of MoMA to canonize. Of course, we have this power, and if we sustain something over a long time, it will probably enter history in some way or the other. Many things that we acquire end up, being not so interesting from a way back, and we also actually have, unlike many public museums, the power to deaccession. That means to get rid of things. To get rid of is now a very negative way of saying it, but actually the painting and sculpture department does it all the time, because obviously they can sell works that they think is not, like if we have 25 Matisse paintings, maybe we don't need 25, we can do away one, and it produces a lot of monetary value on the market, which will then allow us to buy something contemporary that we think is more relevant for an adequate representation of history. That's a little less the case with architecture, but yeah, I mean, this responsibility, it's there. At the same time, also, unlike art, obviously architecture lives its life outside of the museum. What we collect are always representations. We collect models, we collect drawings, films, photography, whatever we can, but of course we can't collect the actual building. And so, I think one of the responsibilities for us, one of the strongest responsibilities is for us to raise awareness of also the preservation value of modern buildings. When something is represented in the collection of MoMA, it probably puts a different pressure on the market forces and on the real estate market to destroy a building. It doesn't always help. For example, there was the wonderful Hall of Nations by the Indian architect Raja Wall, which was really a fundamental key building for the modern Indian independent nation, which was torn down last year despite me and many other colleagues writing letters to the Indian government underscoring how fundamentally important that building is. So again, we are actors in a field with very strong forces, and we are certainly not the strongest force. But we have a voice and we can use it, and sometimes we succeed and sometimes we don't.
El joven que preguntó primero le preguntó que si coleccionaba, ¿por qué no ¿cuál era el criterio del MoMA para coleccionar? Él le preguntó, los museos tienen un rol. El rol del museo es guardar la memoria, pues, de la cultura, ¿no? Si no colecciona lo que se supone que debe coleccionar para mostrarlo después, ¿cuál es el papel del museo?
I think that's a little bit a misunderstanding of what I said. Obviously we collect all the time. And there's a very complex layer of criteria what we collect. We have certain priorities over a certain time. We also are very aware that we operate in the present, and we are arguing, or we are working against the history of collecting at MoMA. Now, the history of collecting at MoMA is, as I mentioned earlier, a very Eurocentric way of looking at modern architecture. So one of the strategic focuses for me in my tenure as chief curator is to change that, to look at other modernities, privileging that over many things that are also interesting that happened maybe in Germany or in North America, because we think that this history is already relatively well represented in our collection, as opposed to the history of, say, modern Colombian architecture or modern Indian architecture or modern Greek architecture for that matter. But collecting is not the only task of a museum and of curating. That's one side of the medal. The other side is showing things that are specifically not represented in the collection and bringing them into a discourse in the sense of an experimental setup or a laboratory or a proposition. We can say, we think this is interesting and we should talk about it. And maybe in the end of the exhibition it turns out actually it's not so interesting. Usually, of course, actually it turns out to be interesting because we usually invest many years before we make an exhibition. So it's obviously not so naive as I'm just saying it. But you know, having the program such as the Young Architects program or allowing contemporary practitioners to do something in the museum space that doesn't necessarily have the weight of the collection is very important, because otherwise we become a mausoleum of objects and we are not a site of production and of the production of critical discourse. So I don't see the two things are both very relevant for our work, and they're not exclusive.
Well, Martino and Camilo, thank you very much for this great talk. My question is right now, well, we understand that the importance of experience nowadays and what kind of experience can present a museum. In the MoMA, have you visualized it implementing new technologies such as augmented reality to increase this type of experiences for the normal citizen?
That's a very good question. And it's a little bit a dilemma. We have obviously introduced, digital media. We sort of try to create content besides outside of the galleries that is accessible online for visitors who may not be able to come to MoMA and so on and so forth. The question of the virtual or augmented reality is a very complicated one for us, because with the current status or of technology, it's not yet possible to handle the many visitors that we have in the museum daily. So for example, I saw a super interesting and great exhibition in the Jewish Museum on the French architect Pierre Charot last year in New York, which used augmented reality very successfully. You could put on these masks and then you saw some objects of the architect, some furniture that he had produced within a 3D setting of what it would have looked like. It was totally amazing. That only works for the time being in an institution where you can control how many people pass through per hour, because it's not yet possible to create that kind of environment for hundreds or thousands of people that pass through MoMA galleries every hour. And so but I think as we move forward, this is of course a great opportunity for us to invest in, and we have formed a new department of digital contents. So we're obviously exploring that, very much aware of the fact that this is something, it's a great opportunity, especially for architecture, which always has to work with representations.
Well, I'm going to go back to the question about the acquisition thing. And I think, there are two different kind of approaches in acquisition, which is the artworks that we see here about architecture. And when I entered here, I was really surprised about thinking that there was a market for architecture itself. And I think now understanding what you're doing, I think that it's more like an educational missions towards to creating value out of something that many people do not know. That many people are not aware of the value or having architectures, people that are willing to express themselves in their own countries. But I think it's very important what you're doing, creating this value, and I think that this is one of the important missions about museums. Something different about architecture is that this process of acquisition and validation is very different from the artwork. Because, as you mentioned at the very beginning, here we're not talking about gallerists or other kind of validation processes that allow... Well, just to finish about it, I think what it seems to me complicated is that you at the end acquire something and you start giving value to something that sometimes this archive doesn't mean a lot to the place, to the people where this archive come from. And that's what I believe that, I don't know, it could be a hard work and that's what research, why research is important about it, how to reveal and create this awareness and maybe try to give this message back to the people where this idea came from, and not just stay with this sensation or this impression about regionalism, which is very uncomfortable. And I agree that we cannot expect to always, keep talking always about Latin American art or just Latin American architecture. We have to really expand ourselves so we really get out of this box, which I don't think it's very valuable for us. Just that.
Well, I think you made thank you very much for clarifying that part of the conversation. I think you sort of made that very clear, and I think indeed there is, of course, a difference. There is not really a market for architecture as a... actually there was. In the 1980s, there were galleries that specifically, represented architectural drawings as work of art. And to some degree, there are still some galleries that do it, but it's not very common, and it's certainly not the only interest we are pursuing as a museum. I think it would also be unfair to say that the collector, the curators of art only collect what has already been established in the art market. For example, we have a fund for 21st century art that specifically looks at, very contemporary production that nobody knows whether it will ever, be a super important position. And it's actually capped at a very relatively low market price value. So there's, I think also on the side of the art curators, a strong interest in not just following the market, but in identifying on our own things that we think are relevant. And the category of Latin America, I just, I feel incompetent to relate to that. I think it would be a little unfair to expect from MoMA to answer all these questions. And I think that's something that, the local culture needs to sort out. If there is an interest in defining what is modern architecture in Colombia, or is there a Colombian modern architecture? I think that's not the task of MoMA to answer that, but that's the task of the curators and historians of this country.
Hola. Mi pregunta es enfocada más que todo en la parte de la educación pública y, digamos, la producción intelectual en cuanto a la arquitectura. Porque actualmente pues hay un museo de arquitectura en la Universidad Nacional y un museo de arte. En el museo de arquitectura se presenta, hay exposiciones temporales de los trabajos de grado, pero toda esta información, todos estos trabajos, digamos, no tienen suficiente trascendencia, sino se ven como algo temporal, como exposiciones temporales. Y pues creo que todo este trabajo tiene mucho valor como producción intelectual de lo que, digamos, está pasando en el país. Y pues quiero saber qué nos puede recomendar para que tenga más trascendencia toda esta información y todo este producto intelectual.
It's in a way probably the situation of every architecture school around the world, that there is a lot of really interesting thinking and intellectual work going into projects that are of purely educational, theoretical interest. And I don't know how I can answer this question. It's I think like in every other art, you know, what is really needed for success is persistence, and I think what architecture schools can do is maybe make sure, or try to make sure, that these final presentations of student works are not just there for the students, but also for the general audience. Again, I think that's very important, to have an audience and to have an understanding, a critical understanding of what architecture can do for a society, because that establishes a dialogue with people maybe who have the potential or the power to build something, or to exhibit something in a gallery or in a museum. So I think it's very important to be aware of the public relations side, without being, I don't mean this cynical, I actually really mean this very, very sincerely. Communication.
Yo agregaría algo a la respuesta, y es: esas responsabilidades no recaen solamente en el lado de la institución. Creo que los estudiantes tienen la capacidad de construir contenido. Hay ejemplos de galerías en el mundo de las universidades, o galerías con iniciativas propias de oficinas de arquitectura, que construyen planes curatoriales para dar valor a eso, y planean temas y planean una agenda a lo largo del tiempo para generar un contenido en el cual la agenda no esté dictada por la institución, sino también por los mismos estudiantes. Entonces yo creo que una manera interesante de mirarlo sería: ¿por qué no pensar que dentro de la universidad hay un comité de curaduría de estudiantes que son capaces de proponer un plan a 1, 2, 3 años y empezar a generar un contenido que es capaz de ser administrado por los estudiantes, administrado por el contenido que ellos generan, administrado por lazos con sistemas de difusión, lazos con sistemas de comunicación, lazos con arquitectos ya titulados, y generar un contenido? Ahí les voy a poner un ejemplo de 2 galerías pequeñitas de arquitectura que existen en Latinoamérica. En Latinoamérica existen 3 galerías de arquitectura autogestionadas muy interesantes. Está el caso de Liga, en México, que es una galería que fundaron los arquitectos de Productora, que es una oficina más o menos joven de México. Está el caso en Panamá de una pequeña galería que se llama Junta, es la unión de 4 arquitectos más o menos jóvenes también, y generan contenido, han hecho unas exposiciones muy bonitas. Y está el caso de Monoambiente en Buenos Aires, que también son unos espacios pequeñitos. Si ustedes vieran el tamaño de estas galerías, es casi increíble pensar que esa galería, que ese espacio es una galería. El caso de Liga es el lobby de entrada de un edificio de oficinas. El caso de Monoambiente es el garaje de un proyecto de vivienda. Hagan de cuenta un proyecto de vivienda de varios bloques, el garaje es Monoambiente. Y en el caso de Junta, por el tema de presupuesto, cada vez que van a hacer una exposición buscan un lugar. Entonces yo creo que es una invitación también a autogestionar esos contenidos y construir contenido, sobre todo teniendo la plataforma del espacio que ya existe del Museo Leopoldo Rotter en la Universidad Nacional. Con esto quiero cerrar esta participación de este primer panel, no sin antes dar muchísimas gracias a Martino por su generosidad y compartir todas estas ideas que sin duda van a alimentar nuestra discusión y surgirán nuevos emprendimientos, tanto privados como públicos, en la ciudad y en el país.